Trump's impeach this strategy came into full view today when he stood before cameras and asked for dirt on his potential opponent from not one, but two foreign governments, apparently banking on norm busting to clear him from law busting when it comes to trading foreign relations for political favors. The comments, described by the New York Times as nothing short of, quote, extraordinary presidential request to a foreign country for help that could benefit him in the 2020 election, came after Trump faced an entire night of criticism over yesterday's foul-mouthed impeachment meltdown and his refusal to answer this simple question from Reuters reporter Jeff Mason, who asked, what were you hoping the president of Ukraine would do about Biden? Today, reporters took another crack at Mason's question, and this time Trump answered with a response the lawmakers investigating him could only have dreamed of. Here's the exchange.
What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. They should investigate the Bidens, because how does a company that's newly formed, and all these companies, if you look at, and by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens. Because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine. I haven't, but it's certainly something we can start thinking about.
Impeachable conduct out in the open. That's according to the Democrats leading the impeachment inquiry around his invitations for election meddling in 2020. Strong words from the Democrat who's at the helm of that probe, House Intel Committee Chairman Adam Schiff.
I find, once again, the president inviting another country to interfere in our presidential elections repugnant and a fundamental breach of his oath of office.
Donald Trump's comments today colliding with an increasingly popular impeachment inquiry that has, in just a matter of days, come to consume his entire administration. At the very moment Trump was speaking to reporters before departure, lawmakers and congressional staff were deposing their first witness in the impeachment inquiry, former Ukraine envoy Kurt Volker. That deposition taking place as a subpoena threat hangs over Trump's White House, a White House facing a demand from Congress for documents related to Ukraine by tomorrow. It's another whirlwind day inside Donald Trump's crisis creation operation. That's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us from the Washington Post, who has just posted a story about that testimony, that deposition with Kurt Volker, White House Bureau Chief Phil Rucker with us on set, Rick Stengel, former managing editor for Time Magazine, Nick Confessori, political reporter for the New York Times, former aide to the George W. Bush White House and State Department, Elise Jordan, and Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson. Because at 4 o'clock, Phil Rucker, your paper and yours, Nick, hit send on news stories. I'm going to read you this one that just came out, Phil Rucker, and ask you to take us through some of what you and your colleagues are reporting from Capitol Hill. Under the headline, Giuliani was warned that Ukrainian claims of Biden's misconduct were not credible. Trump's ex-envoy tells lawmakers. The former U.S. envoy for Ukraine told House investigators on Thursday that he warned President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, that Giuliani was receiving untrustworthy information from Ukrainian political figures about former Vice President Joe Biden and his son. That's according to two people familiar with his testimony today. Kurt Volker, who resigned last week after being named in the whistleblower complaint that sparked the House impeachment inquiry of Trump, said he tried to caution Giuliani that his sources, including Ukraine's former top prosecutor, were unreliable and that he should be careful about putting faith in the prosecutor's story, said the people who spoke anonymously. Volker's testimony offering the first inside account of the Trump administration's efforts to press for Ukrainian investigation into Trump's political rival. Phil Rucker, this testimony today that you and your colleagues just reported on as we sat down seems to put Volker on the side of Tom Bossert, the former Homeland Security advisor who spoke out Sunday on ABC Sunday program saying that they desperately tried to get through to Donald Trump, who was consumed by and taken with these delusions about what the truth was about Ukraine. And it would seem that Kurt Volker trying to paint himself as Bossert-like in terms of trying to shake Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump from their Ukrainian delusions?
I think that's right, Nicole, and we'll learn more about this testimony as the day goes on, I imagine. But it's significant for the reasons you just laid out, and it shows again the extent to which Rudy Giuliani, who is not a government official, he is President Trump's personal attorney, but the extent to which Giuliani has in a way commandeered U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Ukraine, the extent to which he was working with the Ukrainians, he was trying to conduct what he saw as diplomacy in a way that would help his client, the president, politically in his re-election campaign. The problem there is he does not speak for the United States. He doesn't work for the U.S. taxpayers. And he's not, apparently, according to Volker's testimony, dealing with a set of facts, dealing with information that is deemed credible. And it's been interesting the last couple of weeks what Rudy Giuliani's been saying publicly. He's actually talked about his coordination with State Department officials almost as a way to make his work with Ukraine credible and appropriate and proper. And this is the first we're hearing in any official way from the State Department about what those interactions were actually like.
Yeah, Phil, you make a good point. Let me just remind all of our viewers that Kurt Volker, who was not a household name, probably still isn't, was thrust into public view when he was named by the whistleblower, whose entire 7-page account has been corroborated by either presidential outbursts or, as Phil Rucker just alluded to, Rudy Giuliani holding up his cell phone and illustrating the role that the United States State Department played in this entire effort at collusion in plain sight. Let me read some more from the Washington Post story and then bring in former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Michael McFaul. The Post goes on to report today that Volker was named in the whistleblower complaint as the diplomat who set up a meeting between Giuliani and a top advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky amid Trump's effort to pressure Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. The State Department says Volker arranged the meeting between Giuliani and Yermak, but at Yermak's request. This would seem, Ambassador McFaul, to be the beginning of the thread being pulled on what would be Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump's loyalty to right-wing fringe conspiracy theories over the expertise of even the political appointees at the United States State Department. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? We know what could go wrong. And I do know Kurt Volker. I want to say that. I've known him for a long time. He worked in the Bush administration before taking on this job. Remember, Kurt was an unpaid envoy. He was not confirmed by the Senate. He's not part of the State Department. So I think that made him somewhat vulnerable to be the person to try to set this up, right? They didn't go to the ambassador in Ukraine that did this. They went to Kurt. But Kurt knows facts. He knows what the truth is. He knows what the truth is about this prosecutor general, this hero from the right-wing conspiracy, Mr. Shokin, who anybody who knows the facts about him or Ukraine knows that he was not fighting corruption. And it sounds like he's beginning to lay down some of those facts now today in his testimony.
What damage, Ambassador McFaul, can Kurt Volker do to sort of the fragile web of lies that Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani hold up to their own base? It would appear that Mr. Volker is anything but some sort of lefty deep state actor. He was picked by a very, very conservative Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, with deep and vast political ambitions that may be going up in flames quicker than this Ukrainian collusion scam. But it would appear that someone, as you just described, Ambassador Volker was not getting paid. He came in, he was brought in because of his expertise. He knew the Ukraine, and he was willing to play along, it would appear, with empowering Rudy to do something quasi-official. And in the midst of it, he witnessed Donald Trump ask a foreign leader to dirty up Joe Biden's son, and Joe Biden, a potential political rival.
Yeah, I think he may have been appointed by Secretary Tillerson, so I don't think it was Pompeo. Correct me. Somebody will correct us, I'm sure, on Twitter in 5 seconds if I'm wrong on that.
But he was still there. I mean, he was still on the job.
Exactly. No, your point is the right one. And he was trying. I mean, remember what his job actually is. He's not just special envoy for Ukraine. He's supposed to be ending the war in Donbass, working with the Russians, by the way. He has a counterpart. A really, really hard job that everybody, when he signed up for the job, said he was going to fail in. And by the way, he did. There has been little progress on that. The second thing is, you know, if you work in the government and somebody from the White House says to you, can you help my friend, my lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, you're in a pretty difficult position. You know, we'll hear exactly what he said about why he decided to do that, but know that it's very difficult working in the government to not do that. But I applaud him for, if the reporting now is true, that he's not going to go along with this crazy conspiratorial stuff that they've been pushing. And I think he's very credible to undermine that for all the reasons you just said. He is not a left-wing conspiracy guy. He worked in the Bush administration. He works for the McCain Institute, and he was there trying to do the right thing.
Nick, let me read a little bit more from what we're learning. And 2 points of clarification for our viewers. He was appointed by Secretary Tillerson, but kept on for Secretary Pompeo. And this deposition with Ambassador Volker is expected to go on for at least a couple more hours. So we're expected to learn more. But from the Washington Post report that's out, Volker also said that he and other State Department officials cautioned the Ukrainians to steer clear of U.S. politics. Getting involved, he told them, would open up the nation to allegations that they were interfering in an election and could be detrimental to Ukraine long term. That's according to 2 individuals. If only he'd had an audience, you know, with Donald Trump and warned him the detriment of colluding.
I mean, it was quite prescient. I see 2 things going on here. First of all, we should pause and note that the whistleblower and Giuliani seem to agree on this one point, that Volker was pretty obliging to Giuliani in trying to end run the formal process for diplomacy. What we see now here is Volker telling Congress, no, you know, actually, I warned him. It was really bad what he was doing. These lies, this propaganda, this packet of stuff was unreliable. So there's a little bit of CYA here on Volker's part. Mm-hmm. He's doing the right thing. And I think people who have any sense of that part of the world and the history of that prosecutor kind of knew this. And it makes you wonder, for Giuliani, I think he's just generating paper, right? He just wants a sheaf of stuff. What struck me about it was that in some ways it's a mirror image of the Steele dossier, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, you know, and it's a very different motive, right? So the motive for Steele was, I'm worried this incoming president is working with a foreign government to interfere in the U.S. And the motive here was, let's get the foreign government to interfere with the U.S.
It is a stunning sort of circular. There's a lot to unpack there. I want to, though, seize on one of the things that's been said, and that is what the whistleblower alleged about Ambassador Volker's role. Ambassador Volker, the diplomat, is on Capitol Hill today, still testifying. This is from the whistleblower complaint, which nothing that has come out has disproven a word of the whistleblower complaint, despite Donald Trump's threat to out his sources and him or her. Volker, wrote the whistleblower, reportedly provided advice to the Ukrainian leadership about how to, quote, navigate the demands that the president had made of Zelensky. Now, Rick Stengel, it would seem, based on his testimony or his deposition today, that what he's trying to articulate is that he was telling them all to steer clear. But that's not inconsistent with the whistleblower's complaint.
So, you know, I've been talking about Ukraine on this show for a long time. My book, which is out next week, begins in Ukraine. I just want to explain something about what Volker was experiencing. Ukraine has an incredible I love Ukraine. They're fabulous people. They've suffered more than anybody on earth. They're an incredibly corrupt society since they became free of the Soviet Union in 1991. What prosecutors meant in Ukraine, it meant, oh, Eugene, I'm about to prosecute you on something, but if you pay me off, I'm not going to do it. That is what a prosecutor does in Ukraine. What Volker was, I imagine, telling Rudy Giuliani is, these guys will tell you anything. They're desperate. They're boxed in by Russia in the East and by the U.S., you know, here. They're scared as heck. They're going to tell you absolutely anything that you want to believe. I am sure that's what Volker saw. That's what I experienced when I was there myself.
But doesn't that make them the perfect foil for someone like Rudy Giuliani, who wanted someone to tell Donald Trump what he wanted to hear? Well,
except again, I don't want to put words into Ambassador Volker's mouth, but I suspect he's saying, you know, Rudy, they're going to tell you exactly what you want to hear about the Bidens. And remember, the prosecutor that you thought was dirty was the guy that didn't want to prosecute at all.
No wonder Ambassador Volker couldn't bring peace with Ukraine and Russia when he is having to waste his time on this kind of senseless nonsense. We look at how so much in the world has been stagnant because America is just not in a leadership role anymore. quite frankly, because Donald Trump requires all of our envoys around the world to focus on just nonsense.
Well, and it's more than random nonsense, though. I mean, this would be once again a country relying on American military aid to stand up to not Canada.
Right, but Russia.
Not Mexico.
Yeah, but
Russia. I mean, it would seem like nonsense, but not random nonsense. Once again, this was someone who was stymied, and the Ukrainians were held back in their military defenses against Russia because of, as Elise said, nonsense, political nonsense.
Right, and just to mention, not to pour another story under this fire, but I just noticed that ABC is reporting more from the Volker testimony. We haven't confirmed it. You haven't confirmed it. Yep. NBC hasn't confirmed it. But there are text messages from the acting ambassador there, essentially to another diplomat, saying, well, you know, what is this? We're holding up this military aid to help a political campaign back home. I mean, literally in
encrypted
those
messages.
Yes,
in
those words. It's just incredible. It's a couple of things. Number one, I would love to have the whistleblower's sources. The whistleblower had incredible insight into not just what people were saying and doing, but what people were thinking. And that makes me think that the whistleblower had really, really good sources. Yeah. Everything the whistleblower has said has proved out. It's just amazing. And second, I think there's going to be, you know, not one, not two, but probably 6 good stories that come out of this day-long deposition.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious that Volker is just laying it out with documents, with text messages, with everything else.
And he has obviously some concerns, I would imagine, about his own, not just reputation, but there have to be legal concerns. I mean, it would appear to me that the president is treated separately by the Southern District of New York, by Robert Mueller, by different entities. But the people around him have to know that they are not. That there could be an investigation. We don't have any reporting in any of your great news organizations. But these people have to at least be concerned about potentially being co-conspirators.
Well, Volker is Exhibit A. I mean, remember they said we're going to hear from the State Department people, and Pompeo said, no, you can't do this. And Volker basically, no, I'll come in. I'll come in.
He was also
honestly,
the first person to resign. Last Friday.
Yeah.
Phil Rucker, let me just take you back to these galling comments on departure today from Donald Trump, where it was sort of the TV movie version of, I called the code red. Donald Trump saying, China, if you're listening, I want you, it's not just, this isn't work just for the Ukrainians and the Russians. I want your help, too. Is there anyone telling him just how politically, forget about the fact that he's likely to get himself impeached. He seems to be trying to self-impeach at this point. But just the brand to his base seems so off. I'm so feeble. I can't do this by myself. So let me use the levers of statecraft to get help from foreign governments?
Yeah, Nicole, I think a few things are going on here. First of all, this is President Trump just coming up with the message on the fly himself. We know that's how the communications operation in the West Wing works. It's really driven by the president, by the commander-in-chief. But it's also a flashback to that moment in the 2016 campaign when, addressing our friend Katie Tur at that press conference, President Trump said, Russia, if you're listening, and then called on the Russian government to find Hillary Clinton's missing emails and release them to the public. That was such a brazen statement, but it was said out loud in public to reporters on camera. And we saw that again today with China. And it tells you that Trump does not believe that there's anything improper with making a request for election interference from a foreign government, even though that's the subject of this impeachment inquiry. And it's what Democrats are saying is not only improper, but a brazen violation of his constitutional obligations and oath of office.
Ambassador McFaul, just to pick up on Phil Rucker's point, here are all the times he's colluded out loud. I think Ashley Parker writes it as saying the quiet part out loud. Let's watch.
I will tell you this. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening.
China should start an investigation into the Bidens, because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine.
Phil Rucker, we lost Ambassador McFaul, but I think those were some of the examples that your paper cited in this idea that perhaps some of the strategy here is to numb the base, to numb the Trump voter to all this conduct, so that if and when he's impeached, part of the defense is, well, I told everybody I was colluding. You know, it really is sort of the shifting defense of, you know, I never did anything with Russia, to, you know, damn right I asked Russia for their help.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's one other thing to point out, by the way, in the context of the China comments this morning. He made that appeal to China to investigate the Bidens almost immediately after discussing the trade negotiations. Remember, the U.S. is locked in a pretty acrimonious trade war right now with China. And Trump gave something of a threat to the Chinese in those comments this morning. He said, you know, I have a lot of options with China, and sort of intimated that he could be intimidating as the American president in negotiating that trade deal, and then almost immediately went into the Biden issue. And you know, it's interesting to see those two things aligned, because it's similar conduct as we saw in the phone call from July 25th with the Ukrainian president.
It's quid meet quo. Let me play it for you, just what Phil Rucker talked about.
I have a lot of options on China, but if they don't do what we want, we have tremendous power.
So, Phil Rucker, this would again seem to corroborate the structural framework around the whistleblowers' red flag on Ukraine, that military aid was held up. That's a known. That Donald Trump pressed 8 times in one call for an investigation into the Bidens. That's a known. Donald Trump's defense on that is murky to me. It has something to do with not tying them together in the edited version of a transcript with lots of ellipses that we've seen released from this White House, not known for telling the truth. But there, as you said, in full view, talking about threatening China, saying, if they don't do what we want, we have tremendous power, and in the next breath saying they should investigate the Bidens.
Yeah, it's a connection there, and I think this is certainly a new episode that's going to come under scrutiny from the House Democrats as they continue the impeachment inquiry. And the difference is it was just all said out loud and on camera for the world to see this morning. You don't need a whistleblower in this case. You don't need a complaint. You don't need people to come in and be deposed. You just need to watch that 30-second clip of film.
Ambassador McFaul, I spoke to a U.S. government official today in the immediate aftermath of this. And he said basically what Phil Rucker just said, that the president just did on live TV everything that was alleged in the whistleblower complaint. Do you think Democrats would be wise to sort of move away from haggling with this White House over transcripts and locked documents in a safe, and God knows what Trump has in there since he's been writing checks to cover up affairs with porn stars from the Oval? We can only use our imaginations. It's probably unimaginable what's in there. And just move on to what's happening before our very eyes in real time?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the president doesn't seem to understand right from wrong, and he doesn't seem to have anybody around him advising him on that. And just leave the whistleblower complaint out of it. Just read the transcript. The right wing wants to look for a conspiracy behind this. The conspiracy is the person that made the decision to release that transcript, because everything you need to know is right there. The President of the United States tried to leverage U.S. taxpayer money to get another foreign government to investigate his opponent in the 2020 election. And then they tried to cover it up. Full stop. You don't need to talk about anything else. There it is. And I think we get off on these tangents, who talked to who, when, and this transcript, and what else is there. It's there plain as day, and that he doesn't see that it is there is plain as day is still shocking to me, but it doesn't mean the facts are not just crystal clear.
And I think, Rick Stengel, that's why you see public opinion swinging so quickly and so dramatically. CBS had a poll out last weekend before the president stood and attempted to sort of conspire with the foreign government and threaten them in the process. Today, swung to 55% of the public now supporting an impeachment inquiry.
Before I get to that, you threw up the ball, and I'm going to whack it about what Trump said about China. Crossing the T is he gave them so much leverage in the negotiations when he said, maybe China should look into this. Maybe I'll talk to them about that. The Chinese can go, well, Mr. President, we will start looking into that if you start reducing our tariffs. It's the worst negotiating tactic I've ever seen. The reason why it is getting traction is that it's so easily understandable. You have the transcript and he's saying, hey, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. I mean, even using the word favor, that's a word that mafia dons use. Absolutely everybody gets it.
I was going to say, it's exactly why you see the strategy from the White House now is to focus on the process for how the facts got in. They are all in on the quid. They're like, yeah, this happened. We did it. It's great. Collusion is great. Everyone does it. But can you believe how the Democrats heard about it a couple of days in advance? Yeah. That's their strategy.
Well, and just on that, and that's some great reporting from your newspaper, but I think that a timeline that came out even days before that also in your paper put the general counsel at the CIA as the first government official to find out about the substance of the whistleblower's concerns. And what she did was go to the White House counsel's office. So the White House counsel's office knew about it before anybody else. So we want to talk about process. The process is still incredibly incriminating for this White House.
Well, that's right. And the whistleblower was permitted to go to House Intel with these allegations. It's in the statute. And so when he felt that he was not getting enough response from within the agency, they went to the House. That's allowed. That's not. It's good to understand that. It's an important fact. But if they're covering it up, of course you go outside the administration.
Well, and especially if the general counsel, and I've talked to a couple intel sources who say that there is nowhere in the process where the general counsel from the CIA has it as her next step to take it to the White House counsel's office. That is not in any statute.
No, it's only weird if you think that somehow a whistleblower is obligated to not blow the whistle.
Right.
But that's the point of this whole thing. Something bad happened in the eyes of the whistleblower. They're like, I've got to tell somebody.
It's an odd way to defend against impeachment by just continuing to do impeachable things so they'll never catch up, right? You just keep adding to the list.
It's actually a great way of defending against impeachment.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.